All right. Good morning, everyone. I am Fiona. I am here to represent API Social Work Council of Northern California. To learn more about us, you can go to our website, apiswc.org, or email us at apicouncilnorth@gmail.com. But we essentially kind of just host professional development events, networking events. We have a newsletter where we send out resources and newsletters, news resources and opportunities. So definitely check us out because we're just aimed to help, connect students, professionals in the field, and kind of promote a learning space. And we're happy that we get to host this event during AANHPI Heritage Month as well. There's a lot of joy to celebrate about our heritage and our community, and we also acknowledge there's a lot of violence and pain that can happen too, and we want to both hold both, right? How do we support those in our community, and just build our connections so that nobody's really alone. So super happy to have invited our folks here, Devin and Eileen and Nicole. They are here to represent the Asian Law Caucus's legal clinic for victims and survivors of violence. Say that 3 times really fast, to kind of just educate us and provide some information about their clinic, their services, their experiences, and hopefully we can foster a dialogue all together, right? Us social workers in the field, what they've kind of seen in their clinic as well, put together our heads so we can support those who walk through the doors and need some extra support. When you all registered, there was a question that asked about, any questions you might have leading up to this event. And so I'm going to put some of those received questions in the chat so you kind of already know what's already been asked, what might be covered throughout. And then if it also inspires you to think of a different question, you can go ahead and put that in the chat as well. I will be monitoring it. And whichever questions we don't get to that you're like, I really have a burning desire to know, just put it in the chat and ping us. Some of us might just be open discussions for folks. So putting those questions in the chat so y'all can look through it, know what might be covered, little sneak peek. Just put questions throughout the chat. We will have a Q&A segment at the end too, so we will be sure to get to them. But with all that said, I'm going to pass it on to my folks at the Asian Law Caucus to also introduce themselves and get us started. Thank you, everyone, for being here today.
Awesome. Thank you, Fiona. And thank you so much to the API Social Work Council for having us here. I'm going to share my screen. Is everyone able to see that? Okay, cool. Awesome. Yeah, like Fiona said, we're from the Asian Law Caucus. We're part of the community safety team, recently renamed from the Criminal Justice Reform Program to more accurately fit, some of the work that we are doing within the Asian Law Caucus and the community. And yeah, we're here to talk about our legal clinic for victims and survivors of violence and our approach in how we're trying to meet the needs of our community who have experienced some sort of violence or trauma in a new sort of out of the box way that really tries to center our clients who do come through the clinic. But first, we thought it'd be very helpful to sort of paint the picture about ourselves, how we came to the work, and then also about like what is the rationale behind the clinic. So I'll hand it over to Eileen first to introduce herself.
Thank you, Devin. Yeah, so like Devin was saying, you'll kind of see throughout this presentation how stories are important, and knowing everyone's stories really brings context to how harm happens and how repair can be done. So with that, you'll see in the photo, I'm a proud aunt to my niece and nephew, Brandon and Allison. I was born and raised in SoCal, mostly LA and Orange County. I am a survivor of childhood trauma and abuse. I came into this work primarily through my overseas experiences. So I've been to Mexico, Kyrgyzstan, England, and Benin, working with a variety of demographics. Eventually decided to go to law school in Boston. And after graduating, did some volunteer work, teaching a class at a prison east of LA with a program called Prison Fellowship, and then started working as a staff attorney with the Asian Law Caucus back in February of 2023, moved to Oakland a couple months after that. And for most of my professional life, I've been committed to building community safety on the people's terms, not on the state's, and really trying to make sure that we eventually do away with our reliance on violence and policing. And I will pass it to Devin.
Awesome. Hi everyone. Again, my name is Devin, born and raised in San Jose, California. This is a picture with my partner and our two kids, our cats. I grew up in the Japanese American Buddhist temples, and I think that's important because part of my journey to restorative justice work that I'm focusing on at Asian Law Caucus has been making these connections between like Asian American and Asian like religious traditions and how it does like sort of overlap with the restorative justice work and using that as an avenue to talk with our elders and talk with our community members about, where restorative justice principles do come up in our own histories. So it's not as like foreign to them. I received my master's of social work from Seattle University. So this is how I got connected with the API Social Work Council because I'm on your email list. And so I worked as a social worker for a little bit. And I think I'm technically like doing social work now, but it's like not in a social work position. I'm also a trained talking circle facilitator, which is just another way to say like a restorative justice facilitator. But the curriculum that we go through sort of identifies us as talking circle facilitators. And like I mentioned, I'm involved in making connections between API history and our traditions with restorative justice. And like Eileen, and like everyone on our team, I'm committed to building community safety without furthering violence. And a lot of times we see the violence that gets perpetuated in our community through the police and prisons. And I'll hand it over to Nicole.
Thanks, Devin. Hi, everyone. My name is Nicole. I'm a community advocate at the Asian Law Caucus in the community safety program. I was born and raised in Boston. My undergrad was focused on racial equity and justice and DEI work, diversity, equity, inclusion work, and education and on like local levels. And so particularly like in my hometown of Quincy, Massachusetts, and also like my college town of Somerville. And so I started at the Asian Law Caucus in June of 2023, so I'm almost a year now. And I'm currently now located in Union City, in the Bay. And like my other members in the team, committed to building and sharing resources to support community safety without relying on cross-funnel systems. And so I think being able to work in this clinic and particularly get to interact directly with elderly Asian immigrants and Asian Americans really helps me achieve this goal. And just wanted to throw in, I like to read, I like to hike, and go to the movies. And I'm going to get us started by just giving a brief context on the Asian Law Caucus's mission and history. It's the first and oldest like leading legal and civil rights organization that has a special focus on serving underserved, like low income immigrant Asian Americans and Asian and Pacific Islanders. And it was founded in 1972 after winning this landmark case, Chan versus Scott, which relates to our community safety program. It was a lawsuit against SFPD for sweeping of Chinese youth in Chinatown. We also named another like landmark case in 1982, which is regarding ICE for their civil rights violations. And we can continue. Cal versus Roanoke Park, which was in 1997. This is another landmark case that we're noting here. And that brings us to 2018 to the present, where we filed a nationwide like class action suit that challenges unlawful arrest and detention of hundreds of Cambodian and Viet refugees. And so that's to give the brief overview of some of Asian Law Caucus's founding and a bit of its mission and how we are continuing that work today. And I'll pass it over to Devin to talk about our program.
Thanks, Nicole. So that, yeah, like Nicole said, that was like a overview of like the overall Asian Law Caucus's like programs and mission and history. Now we're sort of honing in on Eileen, Nicole, and I's specific team and what we've been doing at the Asian Law Caucus in the community safety program. So we do like 4 sort of different buckets of work. So impact litigation, policy advocacy, direct legal services, and then restorative and transformative justice. So our impact litigation, we've been working on the California Department for Corrections and Rehabilitation, which is CDCR, in a national origin discrimination case. And so a lot of times what CDCR does is that they place holds on people who are perceived to be foreign. And that triggers an ICE hold, so an Immigration Customs Enforcement enhanced hold on that person who has been perceived as foreign. And so that makes them ineligible for a lot of programming within the prison systems. And so Eileen has been involved in some advocacy work around that. And we've also been similarly working on the targeting and harassment of Asian residents up in Siskiyou County by the Sheriff's Department and by the local county government, and I think the local city government as well, where they've really been creating a humanitarian crisis for the Asian community up there because they've been denying them their access to water. And then we've also been involved in policy, and that also sort of overlaps with our litigation work. And so some policy stuff was like the Home Act, trying to advocate for that passing. We do like local policy advocacy that Nicole and our other team members are involved in. As it relates to like immigration and community safety. And then our direct legal services is what our clinic serves, the legal clinic for victims and survivors of violence. And so I'm not going to talk about that right now because we'll talk about it more throughout the presentation because that's what we're here for. And then our last sort of newer bucket of work is restorative and transformative justice. What we're doing is we're working with local community-based organizations in the East Bay and in San Francisco to build out restorative justice practices that are culturally responsive and linguistically accessible to the Asian Pacific Islander community in the Greater Bay Area, and also building up the capacity for restorative justice facilitators to work with clients who are of those backgrounds, because we've noticed that there aren't that many facilitators who have had experience working with the Asian Pacific Islander community. And so that's another thing that we're building up. And then also building up accessibility and understanding within API communities on what restorative justice is. Because if we build out the programs and no one knows what restorative justice is, then we're just going to have like an empty program. And then vice versa, if we build up the knowledge and accessibility for community members to understand restorative justice, but we don't build out the programming, then we're going to get like an increase in people wanting it, but like no programs to do anything for it. So yeah, that's just like a very, very basic overview of the many different programs and issues that our community safety team is involved in. And so it's a really robust like program where we're trying to really address like violence and community safety at various levels of like society. So we have like the government level where we're involved in like policy and litigation. Then we have like a more like meso level where we're working on these community organizations to understand like restorative justice. And then we're really looking at the micro level with our legal clinic and for victims and survivors of violence, where we're honing in on like specific clients who have experienced trauma. And yeah, so that then brings me back to the legal clinic for our victims and survivors of violence. And before we like tell you what we do, we wanted to sort of give you some context into why the clinic was started and like what the reasoning was behind like trying to do like a non-traditional legal clinic, and where that came out of. And so like most people who are living in the Bay Area, we all witnessed and experienced the rise in anti-Asian violence since 2020. And we were seeing a lot of cross-community violence or perceived hate-motivated violence within our community. And we've like sadly, we lost some folks who were killed by this sort of increase in violence. But at the same time, a lot of the responses by many of our community members and many of the government agencies was to increase our reliance on solving anti-Asian violence through increased policing and hate crimes enhancement. Which for our community has been like a double-edged sword. Because like as we have been explaining throughout like the beginning of this conversation, many of our communities have been negatively impacted by police and prisons and have actually been further victimized by those systems. And so as we're trying to build out, community safety for our community, we were trying to think of like how we can combat this rise in anti-Asian violence while also not relying on these institutions that have historically victimized our communities and have furthered our own experiences in trauma and things like that. And another thing, like as we were like talking with clients and as we've learned more about our clients' experiences, like sort of understanding the lived reality of our clients and of like the situation, the larger situation that they surround themselves in, does not oftentimes match up with the what the criminal legal system can offer them or what is currently being provided by the criminal legal system for victims and survivors of violence. And many of the reasons why this is because clients come in with preconceived ideas of what the legal system can provide to them, and are very disappointed or frustrated with the outcomes of of the expectations that we are able to articulate to them. And so this clinic is a way for us to push back at these more carceral forms of trying to solve anti-Asian violence and offer alternatives to an already inadequate system that is already not meeting the needs of the clients, and trying to find ways in which they can heal, find safety, and find accountability outside of the legal system. And so really trying to center their needs on their own terms, when oftentimes the court system, the legal system, and policing and prisons cannot offer them what they actually are seeking. And so that's sort of like the background of our legal clinic and how our vision sort of came out of that, and how we're trying to really embody this sort of ideology as we're moving through the clinic on the day-to-day and in all the follow-ups. But yeah, I'll hand it over to Eileen, I believe.
Thanks, Devin. Yep, so our legal clinic is essentially meant to assist AAPI victims and survivors of violence, to help them navigate the criminal legal system, because most folks do come in with their initial legal questions. So we do want to center those. And then we help the victims and survivors take a step back to identify their personal goals around healing and safety. What does accountability look like to them in their larger healing process? And then to, if they're open to it, to kind of gently introduce them to the other options that are out there beyond just the legal system. So that would include restorative justice or transformative justice processes. And we hold this clinic virtually for the time being, every second Wednesday of the month, for 2 time slots, 1 p.m. and 3 p.m. And we're hoping to eventually move more towards a hybrid and then maybe an in-person model. And let's see, next slide. So the reason why our clinic is not necessarily your traditional legal clinic where you come in with a legal question and you get legal advice is that we are coming into this work with an abolitionist value system, at least from our team. And so we believe that the police can perpetuate or escalate violence rather than diffuse or resolve it. So the image of police that we have in our minds from the media, or TV and movies, where they solve crimes and fix society's problems basically is not accurate. That's not how real life plays out. And we, as the AAPI community, know that to be the case. And so like I was saying earlier, understanding the perpetrator's story matters for the healing of victims and survivors, and it prevents future violence. And I say that because so often we just look solely at the perpetrator's behavior or what was done, looking solely at the harm, and using that to as like a way to identify the perpetrator, when in fact the perpetrator is a human being. They have their own story. They didn't come into the world to do evil, but for whatever reason, their journey led them to that moment. And so I think bringing that context is really important for us in our work. Next, incarcerating the perpetrator is not a sustainable solution, right? These are folks who, in large part, go through our system and do come back into society and become our neighbors again. And so the idea that we can just sort of throw away a person in a cage, lock them up and forget about them is not really going to serve us in the end as a society, because we are all interconnected and we're going to feel the effects of that later when these people are released back into our communities. Yeah, and so to that end, as human beings, we also understand that anyone can be a victim or a perpetrator. A lot of things, especially in relation to violent incidents, it's a matter of timing. It's a matter of what's going on in people's worlds. And so when we really sort of allow ourselves to understand, like, it's not beyond me that I can act in a certain way in any given moment when put in a particular situation. And I think that really humanizes everyone who is involved in a moment of harm. And then moving on from there, our clinic's goals. We want to center victims and survivors' needs first and foremost. And a lot of times the system is not able to do that. The system is usually just kind of running through its typical, the cogs and wheels of like getting cases moving through the system, judges just hearing cases, ending the day at 5, moving on. And in that process, it's usually the victims and survivors who get lost through the cracks. And so our clinic is really trying to make sure that doesn't happen to our community members. Next is cross-community solidarity. And this is to say our pain is real, but so is that of others. You know, when we talk about Asian hate or especially in, the wake of the pandemic and kind of 2021, when Trump was saying a lot of horrible things about our community members, experiencing Asian hate does not give us the right to hate or blame other communities of color. And so this is where we want to address anti-Blackness and anti-Black racism in our communities in particular. There's a lot of history, obviously. The LA uprisings, for example, in the 90s, where it's just very common to sort of see Black versus Asian tension. And part of our clinic's goal is to address that and address cross-community violence to start repairing that and start building solidarity there. And then finally, like we've been saying before, restorative and transformative justice is a huge goal of ours. We do want to see our AAPI communities work through harm and be able to repair outside of the carceral state. So oftentimes what we've been seeing, and we'll note this again later, is that folks just want a quick fix, or they want money, or they want, to see someone punished. But I think this is the harder work of the human being to actually process through grief, process through, I'm not always going to get the answers I need, and so it is processing through. It's not just skipping around to the quick fix. And I think we as a community have a lot of work to do in this particular area. Next slide.
Awesome. Thank you, Eileen. Yeah, so we thought it would be helpful to with our approach, sort of provide some examples in some of the cases that we have been seeing come through our clinic. And I really like the value system that Eileen talked about in her slide, because sadly, it's something that is a lived experience for a lot of the community members who are coming through our clinic. And so a lot of times we can think of the abolitionist value systems as just being this theory that lives above here and doesn't seep its way down into the community. But for probably most of the clients that have come through our clinic, we have seen ways in which those values like or these like ideas that the police can perpetuate violence or escalate violence, that the story matters of the perpetrator and of the victim, and that incarcerating the perpetrator is not a sustainable solution. We really see that in a lot of the cases that our clients are coming in with. So just like a general like overlap of what sort of cases, right? So a lot of times we get a referral from a community partner like Asian Health Services, for example, or just like a cold referral by someone calling our intake coordinator. And these folks have already experienced some sort of violence and have reported it to the police. And as we're talking with them and getting their story, most of them have expressed, and like sort of lackadaisical behavior or mentality by the police, like not really taking their case seriously, not responding to their if they have like an officer or detective assigned to their case, sort of mentioning that they're not responsive. They've been treating them actually like pretty rudely in their correspondence with them, as the victims themselves, right? And so not really meeting like their needs, again, like not being responsive. And so we've really seen like this inadequacy by the police that are meant to like serve them. And then also like in a way we've heard from clients that they suggested that they take the security camera footage of where the incident happened, but there's been like some sort of refusal by the police to go ahead and do that, or any sort of follow-up on that if they had to go get a warrant to even do that. And then a lot of times our clients who do come through the clinic are not notified about the status of the perpetrator. So they don't know whether or not the DA decided to press charges on the perpetrator of violence who assaulted them. We just had a client whose neighbor had assaulted them, who lived in the same apartment building, but they didn't know the status of whether or not that person would be have charges pressed against them, or if they would be removed from the setting. And so we really see like this lived experience for our clients. Although they may not be naming it themselves, we are seeing it like this really inadequacy of like this system that's meant to protect them not doing its job. And so that's a lot of the cases that we have been seeing where it does we do really have to then center what the client wants in terms of their safety needs, in terms of their healing needs, in terms of their accountability needs, because the system itself is proving that it cannot do that for them, right? And so we've also had clients who have wanted the perpetrator of their harm to go to prison or go to jail. And we also sort of see where that isn't like Eileen said, is like it's not a sustainable solution. Because one, that's up to the DA to press charges. And for a lot of these cases, the DA hasn't pressed charges for them, or it's not like like put this in quotations, it's not a serious enough offense for the person to be incarcerated. And so a lot of the times when it's a neighbor on neighbor violence, they have to end up like living together. Unfortunately, that's the case, right? And so the neighbor who assaulted me is still going to be my neighbor. And so how can we like center my healing needs or center the client's healing needs with this understanding that there isn't a lot we can do to remove this person from the situation. And how does that like help, or how can we help you with this sort of situation? And so those are some of the cases that we have been seeing where the policing system isn't really like supporting the clients. But we've also been seeing some like immigration issues that come up after like a violent trauma has occurred. We've been seeing a lot of domestic violence and sexual assault cases coming through. And then through domestic violence, we've also been seeing like some child custody cases coming through. And then also, like I mentioned before, like housing issues where it's neighbor on neighbor violence that escalates into physical violence. We've also seen like harassment and restraining orders by community members who are like just like a business owner versus like a shop tenant or like a shop person who's going. And we've also seen victims who are wrongfully deemed the suspects or perpetrators in these cases. And most of these cases actually are not cross-community violence that we have been seeing. They're actually like Asian on Asian like instances of like disagreement or sort of like an argument that then escalates into like actual physical violence. And so that's something that we are working through of like how can we best address a lot of these things as we again move through our clinic and try and build out community safety for our community while also understanding like a lot of the solutions that are provided that are you know sort of spoon fed to us through like the media and through like the police and what they want is not sustainable for our clients' own healing and accountability and safety journeys. And that's really something that we've been trying to grapple with, and then also trying to help our clients understand that, because I think it's really difficult for us to talk with our clients and help them sort of understand that when they really do want the perpetrator of their violence to go to jail, or they want a restraining order, and how can we help them, you know, have these realistic expectations while also like keeping their needs and their goals and their healing in mind has been a very difficult challenge. And so with that, I think it would be helpful for us to like dive into like two specific cases, one where we've sort of been successful in having like that conversation with like over multiple times. And I'll lean on Eileen for that to like sort of like talk through and we'll keep out a lot of like identifying information. So we'll just do like a very basic thing, but we'll talk about like how this person went from a very pro-carceral mindset of really wanting police and prisons to how we sort of have been able to engage with them in conversation to sort of be more ambivalent towards the police and understand that they might not be the best solution for them. And where we're at with them now. And then I think we'll go into one where we weren't as successful in that. And I can, either me or Nicole can share one of those ones where we haven't really been successful in talking through that with the client and then not helping them with some of the expectations that they were seeing. So maybe Eileen, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Evan. Next slide. Right, so some of the successes has been for us to be able to get some of the clients who were initially very pro-carceral, very pro-prosecution to slowly become more open to alternatives. And that comes with a lot of sort of gentleness and empathy in our conversations with them, to kind of help them understand the larger scope of how their healing can really come outside of the system, and that someone else's punishment doesn't actually make them feel better in the end. So one of the examples is one of our earlier cases where an Asian woman was physically assaulted, and that particular case was a cross-community violent situation. And really, it sort of started out with her just wanting him to disappear, to be gone, you know, to stay away from the community. And when we dug a little deeper, one of the things that she noted was like, she said safety to her would feel like being able to step outside of her home and not feel afraid, right? So it really is this question of fear, whether it's actual or perceived. People want the liberty to be able to breathe easily when they move in and out of the spaces that they live in. And so one of the things was we had a potential opportunity to bring in the defendants, one of the parents, and this parent was noted as being supportive of the defendant. And, you know, we initially brought up the idea of potentially having our client speak with this particular defendant's family member. And she initially showed some resistance to that. That was a particularly difficult conversation for her, but we sort of, gently moved her through it, showing gratitude for her kind of pushing through these harder conversations, allowing us to ask these harder questions to the point where she slowly opened up to the idea and could understand that maybe there is more than just the sort of carceral context of like police and DA's office and just letting the system do what it does in its limited way. Other instances, so we do have a couple cases where it's like more long-term support for clients' healing processes. One of the ways that's been happening, kind of unique, is one of the families, basically one of their loved ones was passed away. And so there's a city council member who had offered the idea of putting up a commemorative plaque on the street where the loved one was killed. And so we've been assisting the family with the application process of that with the city. And that for this particular couple has been really healing for them, just knowing that there would be some way to memorialize who they lost, particularly because one of the things that came out of the conversation with this client was that the real takeaway for them was they kept saying over and over again, it feels like the police don't care. They like my lost loved one does not matter to them. And that was really striking for us because I think it's wanting kind of that affirmation of the value of life, in our community, that when one of us is gone, like it should matter to those who are supposedly, supposed to protect and serve us. And so we have kind of been on this very fortunate journey of helping them in this unique way of feeling a little bit closer to closure and processing through that grief by getting this commemorative plaque. And so that to say, I think by building out this clinic, we've been growing wider acceptance for these alternatives, not only among our community members, but also local community-based organizations, our donors, just really introducing this innovative approach to your average legal clinic by focusing more so on the client's goals for healing and safety, asking questions that you would never see a DA or police officer ask, right? And allowing them to take agency over their healing process and just using that to explore other options to meet those goals. So oftentimes that will come through alternatives to the criminal legal system. And then finally building out a network as a result of service providers with similar goals and intentions.
Right. And yeah, so with all of those areas of successes that we've had, we've also had like areas of growth. And I'll explain maybe one client consultation that we've identified as like an area of growth for us. And then Nicole will go into more about like other areas of growth. So an example of where we've sort of like had a difficult time in supporting a client's needs while also helping them see where this isn't a viable solution for them is in this one case where it was a neighbor on neighbor, Asian on Asian instance of violence where the client had come in to our clinic expressing that their neighbor has like repeatedly like assaulted them or hit them or like stolen some of their stuff. And it's been happening over a course of a long time period. And so he came into our clinic wanting to, find like a remedy for this. And then also like with explicit, needs and goals of filing for a restraining order and even trying to get the neighbor evicted from the from the unit itself. And so when we're hearing from our client is that the client also suffers from some because they're elderly, they suffer from some like memory loss and he feels that he's not like mentally there to be able to represent himself in like uh a legal proceeding, and was like seeking like lawyers to help provide guidance to him on that. And then he also expressed to us that the perpetrator of violence was also someone who he believed to have like some sort of like mental health issue as well. And he even himself identified that as being a reason as to why the neighbor might be, you know, always up in our client's like business and trying to sort of like annoy him and like assault him, right? And so where we weren't as successful is or really not successful is that we were trying to really explain to our client like what a restraining order would do, how it can only be, you know, executed in certain ways. And especially if this is a neighbor, like how can we meet your safety needs? But I think we weren't able to really get to what the client wanted, which was that immediate safety need of like of the neighbor like being like right next to them, and then having to like live next to this neighbor like day in and day out, right? And then with the restraining order, it was like a very difficult, like touchy situation where, you know, our legal team didn't have any capacity to help him with the restraining order since he came in. His hearing was like the next week, I think. And even if we were able to take it on, it wouldn't have been enough time for us to like do anything for that. And then we also weren't successful in trying to have this larger conversation with him about like what are the root causes of like his needs and like what are the root goals of his needs and like how can we like build out a better picture for accountability, safety, and healing as it really pertains to your needs. And some of the reflections for myself on that are there was a language difference in language, and so we were going through an interpreter, and so I think that could have been one of the areas of growth where, you know, there is a lot of time lost in between us speaking to the client and then the interpreter going back and forth. So it creates a harder ability for us to have a candid conversation where we're able to jump in different parts where we're able to identify, oh, like this could be a way where we could like an avenue where we can like explore this more with the client. But because of the interpreter and us not having the language capacity in our own team to have that conversation with the client without an interpreter, we have to wait for the interpretation. And then oftentimes either the client jumps in or we jump in too early through the interpretation where we aren't able to draw those avenues to where we can have this larger conversation to meet their safety needs. And so that's one area of growth. And I'll hand it over to Nicole to talk about some larger picture areas of growth that we've identified as well.
Cool. Thanks, Devin. Should we move on to the next slide? Okay, cool. Thank you. Yeah, like Devin mentioned, I think something that we're recognizing is that we have to address a client's immediate safety needs before opening up this introduction to alternatives. And we can do that a bit like while we can provide that introduction while addressing their immediate safety needs, sort of like how Devin mentioned, by addressing like needs for shelter, also addressing like their immediate physical threat that's surrounding them. And I think because of that, we have been reframing our consultations to accommodate these like gentle introductions to alternatives. And in that, we're recognizing too that it requires a lot of time. It can't just be an introduction immediately. And so because of that, we are expanding our capacity to do multiple consultations over a longer period of time, knowing that we have to commit to working with these clients and not just like a one-time consultation. We're finding that we have to do this over a continuous process so that we can provide long-term support and also more comprehensive support as opposed to just sort of answering their legal questions and then sending them off after that. And another area of growth that we're also identifying is in order to accomplish this, we're finding that we really need to be working on engaging with our volunteer attorneys who we're working with so that they can be also grounded with this political education and understanding of restorative justice because we're recognizing that not everyone comes with that understanding. And so it could be really easy for a volunteer to focus more on just answering these legal needs and not answering more comprehensive aspects of clients' needs for healing and safety. And I think with that, I'm gonna pass it on to Devin. I see that there's some movement in the chat, so that's why I'm sort of looking at it as well. But I will pass it on to Devin.
Yeah, thank you, Nicole. We can address those questions in a little bit, but I think we wanted to ask you all questions in terms of like your capacity within the organizations that you work in as social workers, as well as like these are like reflection questions that we have on our team, like these very big picture questions to like support our communities and support our clients. And so we wanted to make sure that, you know, we had time to reflect on this as well. And so maybe what we'll do is we'll put these questions here, and then we can go back to the questions that you all had for us and answer those, and then come back to these questions that are here and then do more of a sort of discussion as well. So just really quickly, our questions that we had for all of us here are, what issues are you seeing with your clients and your communities in the areas in which you work in? How can we best support our clients while also not replicating systems of harm that perpetuate further violence? How can we support our clients in mapping out realistic goals for their healing, safety, and accountability while also doing our best to center their needs? And then how can we mitigate our own expectations and navigate non-closure with clients whose needs can't be met through the legal system, and the clients are not open to pursuing other options, or no other options are available to them? And so, yeah, we want to keep these questions in like the back of our mind, and then we can, we'll return to them after we open it up maybe for a little bit of Q&A for any of the questions that you all have for us. So maybe I'll stop sharing, and then Eileen, if you want to address the question that came through the chat, we can return back to the Q&A.
Yeah, I'm just looking at Vicky's question here. I was actually typing a response, but I could just read it out loud. So yeah, definitely appreciate the question. Some example questions that we might ask in a consultation will be, what are your bigger picture goals around healing or accountability or safety, depending on which of those issues kind of were more prevalent in the conversation? What does safety look or feel like to you? What's the underlying motivation for wanting compensation, for example, or prosecution? And then again, kind of the probing question I mentioned earlier about sort of, does someone else's punishment actually bring you more peace, right? And often folks kind of wrestle with that and find that maybe that doesn't, you know, there's a disconnect there. So kind of asking these open-ended questions, but in a way that helps folks understand that typically what they come in saying their goals are, they will typically leave having different answers because these questions are meant to sort of give them a chance to really wrestle with those like inner thoughts, inner conflicts around what's going to make them feel better and what's going to actually bring them that peace and that healing.
Yeah, I think another example going off of Eileen is like what we do is like in the framing of the question too is like what would what would the person going to jail mean for you, right? Like what does that mean for you? And I think that's a very important question because they don't often think about that in like this like way that it like talks through like their healing. Um, and I think another thing that we've seen is like sort of like what I was mentioning was like finding these things that the client are saying and then drawing like lines and creating avenues to talk more about alternatives outside of the police, right? So we've had like I think I mentioned before that we've had clients who have really expressed like a disappointment with how the police are handling their case, and disappointment in how the police are treating themselves. And so what we're trying to do now is um, draw that line there to be like, well, it's what we're hearing from you is that, you know, the police officer assigned to your case really isn't supporting you and really isn't, um, um, doing what you feel needs to be done to meet your needs. And so drawing your line, like, do you feel like there are ways in which you can find that healing and find that safety and accountability outside of the police? Because we have to be realistic with them and be like, this is unfortunately like how the police actually are interacting with many of our clients. So it's not like you're not like sadly you're not like a one-off time. And so creating like when finding what the clients are saying and then drawing those lines into like those alternative conversations. Do folks have any other questions or comments? I'm seeing Fiona said that she works with minors, and the hardest piece that I see sometimes is when minors who have experienced assault or violence still continue to go to school with the perpetrating student and still feel unsafe. And then Carmen put in the chat that I work primarily with older adults. In physical abuse cases, they are too traumatized to consider interacting with perpetrator. Seems greater need for prison reform, like adopting Norwegian model that actually rehabilitates prisoners.